Welcome to Trust Talk. In this episode, Steve Van Riel, Senior Strategy Director and EMEA Head of Trust Development at Edelman UK, takes us on a journey from his involvement in UK politics to his current work in consumer trust research. In the 2015 UK general election, Labour wasn't trusted to manage finances effectively, while the Conservatives weren't trusted to do so compassionately, leading to an inconclusive result. This experience underscores the importance of trust in high-stakes elections. Steve's academic research, influenced by Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, examines how System 1, fast intuitive thinking, and System 2, slow deliberate thinking, processes affect trust decisions. In consumer trust, low-stakes decisions often rely on fast thinking with simple rules of thumb, while high-stakes decisions require slow, deliberate thinking where evidence is carefully weighed. He talks about trust games, offering a more nuanced, risk-based measure of consumer trust compared to traditional surveys. For quick, intuitive decisions, companies can leverage simplicity and familiarity to build trust, using elements like simple logos, straightforward messaging, and user-friendly websites. For more deliberate decisions, businesses need to provide detailed, reassuring information and emphasize their reliability and regulatory compliance. He highlights the challenge boards face in turning abstract trust concerns into actionable strategies. He shares successful examples, such as Tesco's approach to pricing and McDonald's efforts to rebuild trust over decades. He concludes by highlighting the ongoing challenge of maintaining precision and discipline in trust research. He stresses the need for practical applications of academic insights to solve real-world problems, using the example of how Boeing could apply trust research to rebuild its reputation after a series of accidents. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Steve, welcome at Trust Talk. Before we go into your work on brand trust, I'd like to take a step back to about 10 years ago when you were actively involved in UK politics. You wrote an article for the New Statesman after the 2015 UK general election, analyzing the role of trust in that election and in politics generally from a viewpoint of someone directly involved rather than as an academic. Could you share some insights from that experience?
Sure. So I suppose the thought for me is always, are elections about just being popular, or are they really about being trusted? And I think it varies depending on the election, but it's a really useful frame. So I worked for the Labour Party at the end of the kind of New Labour period. And by the time I was sort of sitting at some of the top tables, 2008, 2009, we weren't a very popular government. We'd been in power for over a decade. We'd been involved in big foreign policy crises. The economy had crashed. Gordon Brown was our prime minister, and he had strengths, but he was also criticised a lot as not being very polished. And our opponent was David Cameron. He was very polished, quite charming, had a big lead in the polls, nice family, said things that was hard to disagree with for a lot of people. But the amazing thing wasn't that Labour lost the subsequent election because they were likely to, but that the Conservatives didn't do too well. They didn't get the majority that you expect in the UK. And doing work on that campaign, what we found was that Labour didn't become more popular as you got to the election, but there was a real lack of trust in the Conservatives' motives. This was a time when everyone agreed on the need to cut public spending, but there was a sense that the Conservatives really wanted to cut some of the things that people found quite valuable. So my conclusion coming out of that election was that it was really a trust election, that Labour wasn't trusted to sort out the public finances in an effective way, a competent way, but the Conservatives weren't really trusted to do it with compassion. And so you ended up in this situation where neither party got a substantial majority. And so when I look at politics since then, since the experience of that campaign, has always been that the trust prism is a really useful way of thinking about particularly big elections where there's a lot at stake. Trust might not matter where people think there's nothing to lose or the stakes are low. When the stakes seem high, it's not just about how likable the parties are, how likable the leaders are, but it's what do you trust them for and what might you have doubts about.
I feel like we could fill the whole podcast with this, but let's move on to the real subject of our interview today. Your 2021 thesis was titled Trusting Fast and Slow. And it appears to draw from Daniel Kahneman's influential work Thinking Fast and Slow. Could you explain how Kahneman's concepts have influenced your practical study into consumer trust?
Of course, and Daniel Kahneman was an absolute giant of the field. He died very recently. Thinking Fast and Slow is a book everyone should read, and it brings together a lot of thinking from different parts of behavioral sciences that tries to say, essentially, we work in different ways depending on the context we're in and how we're thinking. So when we're doing a quick task like driving on a familiar road, we work one way. When we're doing a slow task like figuring out a maths problem, we work a totally different way. And the great thing about Kahneman's work is that he encapsulated a lot of these things in very neat, very movable ways. And so I was able to then go, right, here's a model. Let's take that model and apply it to the world of trust. So what sort of task is deciding whether or not to trust? Is it a fast task that we do on instinct immediately, or is it a slow task where we have to weigh up the evidence and really apply ourselves?
Our behavior is influenced not only by conscious choices, but also by automatic subconscious processes. I think in psychology this is often discussed in terms of system 1 and system 2 thinking. Could you explain how these different types of thinking affect consumer trust in brands?
Absolutely. Kahneman and people like him have talked about these fast type 1 processes that where there are easy rules of thumb and that allow us to make lots of decisions very quickly. So we don't calculate the best route to work every day. We just do what we did yesterday. Or we have a rule of if my train's delayed, I go by bus, that kind of thing. Our brains do have the power to go beyond these simple rules and weigh the evidence and decide what's the best thing to do. But we only do that really when the stakes are high or the situation is unusual or we're having to concentrate because it's difficult. So if you imagine I came to Amsterdam for a big job interview, I would use my type 2 reasoning to decide whether to fly or to get the train or to arrive the night before and what I should wear, because it's not a city I know well, it's not my regular habit, it's not a language I know well. So I really need to concentrate. I don't do that deciding where to go to work every day. So how does that apply to trust? Some trust decisions are low stakes and familiar and they feel super easy. What newspaper should I buy in the morning? Where should I buy my morning coffee from? I don't think about who is most trustworthy in these situations with great depth anyway. But some trust decisions are high stakes, they're unfamiliar, they feel hard. So where should I put my kids into nursery? Should I go ahead with this new surgery that might affect my health? That kind of thing. Which car should I buy? What house should I buy? And the thought I had working with Nick Chater in the behavioral sciences group at Warwick Business School was, will the way we decide to trust or not change depending on whether we're thinking fast or thinking slow?
According to the consulting model you developed, businesses need to adapt their strategies based on whether consumers use their fast or slow cognitive processes when forming trust judgments, like you just mentioned. Could you describe how a company might approach building trust differently for consumers who make quick, intuitive decisions compared to those who take a more deliberate, thoughtful approach?
Yeah, I think this is where it becomes really practical for businesses and organizations. So if you're a business that needs to win the trust of customers in a hurry, who aren't thinking much about your product, then there's lots of evidence of the different biases and heuristics and rules of thumb people might use. So one that I'm really interested in is called a fluency effect or a fluency heuristic, where people just go for the simplest choice. So if you see something with a simple logo or a simple name or a simple website with no jargon, maybe you trust it more. And that works really well in situations where people aren't thinking about trust that much. They're not thinking about the risks that deeply. They're in that system 1, type 1 processes. But now imagine you're a company that offers something high stakes, like investment advice, and it's quite hard and quite complicated, and customers are thinking quite slow. Actually, in those situations, a simple font, a simple website is not necessarily going to have much of an impact on people's levels of trust. What might do is some more complicated arguments. So one that I've looked at is the idea of when you're in system 2, you can think about the incentives of the other person across the table. So if I'm selling investment advice, maybe I talk about actually, I could get into real trouble if I lie to you. If I do any kind of mis-selling, I could lose my license, I could lose my business. Because my industry is so heavily regulated, I need to be really careful in what I say. In system one, in type one thinking, that's kind of negative. It's not particularly promising as a way of building trust. But when people are thinking in a more type two, more focused way, they can go, aha, he's saying that. So if I was in his shoes, I wouldn't try and do things that are deceitful or distrustful because the risks to me would be too high. And what we found in some of the research that I did around with Warwick and the thesis was that you could increase trust in a bank, for example, by using that kind of messaging of saying we can't afford to be untrustworthy, provided people were using that type 2 reasoning.
You introduced a novel risk-based measure for assessing consumer trust, which challenges the traditional risk-free survey methods widely used today. Could you tell us a bit how this new measure better captures the nuances of consumer trust and why incorporating an element of risk is so crucial for understanding true consumer trust?
99% of the time, when we measure trust, we say, hey, Severin, on a scale of 1 to 9, how much do you trust Steve? And you give your answer. And we usually give you a barrage of those questions. So we ask about Steve, we ask about John, we ask about Jane, we ask about lots of different people. And going back to our two processes from Kahneman, when people are filling out those kind of surveys, they're probably using that type 1 thinking quite a lot. There's no consequences to the number they give. They need to fill out lots of these things in order to earn any money from it. They're probably doing it with the TV on in the background. So they're probably in that type 1 mode. That's fine if you want to know about how they will act in type 1 situations. So if you look at the survey answers to a trust question about a coffee chain, for example, they probably do line up pretty well with whether you actually trust the coffee chain to sell you good coffee. Then there are lots of situations where trust decisions are this type 2 high stakes decision. And then the survey might not be quite so good at predicting what you're going to do about buying a house or choosing which company to work for or choosing, to go back to my old world, a prime minister in a crisis. So what we sought to do was to deliberately develop a measure of consumer trust that built on the type 2 slow thinking by introducing an element of risk into the decision.
In your most recent article, you introduced the concept of using trust games as a research tool for understanding brand trust. Can you explain how these games work and what insights they can provide about consumer behavior towards brands?
This is a really fascinating area for me. The trust game is this tool that behavioral and experimental economists have used for about 30 years, and it's an alternative to using those surveys that I talked about. So the classic format is that you get given $10, you can transfer some of that to me, and anything you transfer is tripled, but I decide whether or not to return some of the money. So if you really trust me, you transfer the $10, it turns into $30, maybe I give you 20 or 15 back and keep some for myself. But if you don't trust me, you shouldn't transfer anything because I could just keep all the money. That's a really simple version, but it's been the heart of this huge research agenda on trust behavior for 30 years because it's a game with real money and it measures what people do around trust, not just what they say. And for me, there's kind of two big takeaways from that. Firstly, that literature has started to show this idea of trust happening differently, whether it's fast or slow. So these games are often a bit more involved, they require a bit more thinking, and you can see patterns where people are thinking more, being a bit more discerning, using fewer of those heuristics and simple rules to decide what they should do. But secondly, it prompted me to design a trust game that could work in the world of brands and organizations. So similar idea. This time, essentially, we ask you to take a bet on whether a brand is going to do something that's trust destroying. So, say you have $10, you can triple it if you bet that, for example, Coca-Cola won't have to do a major product recall in the next year. And that bet, that decision, is a behavioral, incentivized decision around how much do you think it's likely that something could go wrong for Coca-Cola. And what we found was that this sort of bet was more complex, more valuable to people because there was real money at stake. And so they used that type 2 reasoning. And that meant that they were able to look past for example, organizations they didn't like very much. So they looked at investment banks, for example, and people were fairly negative about investment banks. They didn't like them very much. But when you asked them to bet on whether something would go right or wrong for, say, JP Morgan, they actually think, well, things are probably going to, if they have my money, they're probably going to look after it reasonably well. They're going to do their job pretty well, even if I don't love the idea of an investment bank.
With regard to trust game, you also mentioned the concept of betrayal aversion in trust games. Can you explain a little bit about what betrayal aversion means and how that translates into consumer relationships with brands?
Betrayal aversion is this really fascinating concept developed by Iris Bohnert at Harvard and her colleagues. And the idea is it's worse to be let down by another person than it is to be let down by something impersonal like the weather. And that's what distinguishes trust from just taking a gamble. We trust another person to not let us down, but we don't trust that it will be sunny when we go on holiday. That's an impersonal thing. It's more a chance thing. So if you're a brand, it's really interesting to think about, when are people thinking about you as an impersonal, huge organization that's not really a kind of a partner to them, and when do they think of you as another person? So if they interpret your actions as the flight's late, is that because there happened to be some weather blowing in the wrong direction, or something went wrong with the computers that was totally unavoidable? Maybe they don't think of that in trust terms. They don't have this betrayal aversion feeling. But if they feel like the flight's late because actually this company never books the right slots, or because they are trying to maximize their revenue somehow, then suddenly people are a lot harder on the idea of things going wrong, and they'll need extra reassurance to convince them to trust you.
Steve, I wanted to talk with you about your previous job before you joined Edelman. You worked at Teneo. You published an article highlighting the challenge boards face in turning abstract concerns about trust into actionable strategies. So how can boards effectively do that, from changing abstract to action?
Back in about 2018, 2019, I did this piece of analysis with Basil Towers, who's an expert in corporate reputation. Has been doing this long-running series of interviews with corporate affairs directors, CEOs, and corporate boards. And he'd seen the word trust rising up their agenda, increasingly discussed, and we partnered up to try and ask, what are boards really talking about when they talk about trust? And what we found was, in very broad terms, a kind of consensus that trust matters a great deal for corporations, but no real consensus on what to do about it. The board is meant to hold management accountable, but how can it hold management accountable for achieving the right levels of trust? And in some ways, can only be done in retrospect, that we see, that decision broke trust, or that appointment was the wrong decision to build trust, and we can only do it after the fact. So that was the worry. If I can simplify what we heard from these different board members, I think there were some who felt it's important, but it can't be systematized. So we just have to keep trust as an idea in mind. So we use trust as a lens to ask good questions, especially about risk, but that's all we can do with it. Then there were others who really felt trust was a sectoral question. So it was all about, do people trust our kind of business or businesses in general? But that really left quite a little role for management or the CEO in terms of driving that overall. And I suppose for me, the most promising and kind of precise discussions were sometimes in businesses that felt they had lost trust. So they'd seen trust before and then they'd seen it go for whatever reason, because they could more easily see what the route back might be and why it would be valuable. And for those businesses, trust felt much more precise, much more something that they do need to control from a kind of board level, and something that could lead to ultimately value for all the board stakeholders.
You mentioned that trust is often considered too abstract for meaningful measurement and accountability. How do you recommend companies overcome this challenge to ensure that trust is not just a buzzword, but a quantifiable and integral part of business strategy and evaluation?
So for me, it's all about identifying where trust matters to your business. Being trusted is nice to have in general, but being trusted by this stakeholder to do this critical thing, and then suddenly you're out of buzzword territory and you're in real business territory. So often what I ask with clients today is, where is the trust you can't afford to lose? Is it with your most loyal customers? Or is it with the regulator? Or is it with your long-standing employees? What things can you never allow them to doubt you about? Is it about your ability to deliver on time and on budget? Is it about the idea that you will always be fair in the decisions that you make? What are the things that, if they disappeared, it would cause your business real problems? And it doesn't always have to be downside risk. You can also look at the upside. So look at any business's growth strategy, and more often than not, underpinning it are assumptions about trust. So they say, we want to enter this new market. Okay, well, we need the trust of people in that market. We need the trust of our partners in that market, our regulator in that market. We want to launch a new range. So how much more popular would it be if consumers felt really confident in the quality of our products, like the most trusted part of our sector? We want to acquire a new company, say, how long will it take for their people to trust our leaders? These are the areas where it suddenly becomes valuable. If you make it about the trust a business really needs, then suddenly boards, CEOs, other decision makers start to sit up and take notice.
You advocate a whole company approach to trust, stressing the need for a unified framework across all business units. Can you explain how such a framework helps in aligning various departments towards a common trust strategy, and perhaps give us an example on how this has been successfully implemented?
Absolutely. So Basil and I were thinking about the board, and we wanted to give them a way of looking across the company at trust, because they have to look across all these different departments, different roles, and trying to weigh things up is difficult. So the way we approached it was, firstly, look at the business benefit of being trusted and the risk of not being trusted. So look at where the gains and losses might be made. So you're going to find it easier to recruit talent or win investment or maintain your pricing if you're more trusted, for example. Look at that side of the equation, and then look at where in the business is trust actually won or lost. Is it the decisions made in the product design? Is it the decisions made in operations or in supply chain or by the legal team? And often you find that there's a disconnect between the gains and losses of trust on one side and the people making the decisions and the actions and the behaviors that actually drive whether you're seen as trustworthy or not. And so the job that leaders can do within a business is to try and bring those things together. And a single framework, this is what trust is for us, this is where it matters, makes that much easier. So to give you an example, at Teneo, we worked with Dave Lewis, who came in as CEO of Tesco, the UK's biggest retailer, in 2014. And we did a lot of work with him. But one thing that he talked about publicly was he identified what he called yo-yo pricing as something that undercut trust in Tesco. This was something where you put an item in your basket one week and it was one price because it was a bargain, and then you did the same again next week and actually it was much more expensive. Now, the people deciding prices and discounts at Tesco were just doing their job and trying to maximize revenue, and they were thinking about what they could do to bring people in and win that week, but they weren't necessarily set up to think about the signals that they were sending about how trustworthy Tesco was as an organization as a whole, how much it could be relied on. And so when Dave Lewis came in, he identified that as one of a number of different things, many different areas where the actions that were being taken on a day-to-day basis were actually undermining the business's ability to win trust in the long term. The most successful examples I've seen are something like McDonald's in the UK have achieved really dramatic shifts in trust levels over a couple of decades. It's been by having this kind of joined up ways of working that brings together marketing, HR, sustainability, communications, operations, all into one conversation about how trusted are we, why do people trust us? Why might people not trust us? And how do we work together in order to increase trust?
Steve, as we wrap up our interview, what challenges do you foresee for organizations like Edelman, where you lead its trust consulting in the field of trust research?
So I think the biggest challenge around trust is it's such a popular word and a popular idea. It's easy for the real meaning to get lost. So you start off with a conversation about being trusted, but it quickly turns into a conversation about just being popular. Or you start off with a conversation about someone trusting you, and it quickly turns into your own sense of whether or not you are a good organization. So for me, trust's power is that it connects beliefs with actions in circumstances that aren't in our control. And that's really specific and unique to trust, but it can easily get lost if trust becomes a kind of motherhood and apple pie that everyone wants to be trusted for everything in a kind of vague sort of way. So for me, the real challenge for anyone working in the area of trust is to be disciplined and precise about what trust is and why it matters. And the more you do that, the easier it is to bring different strands of thinking, because there are so many together to work on a single problem. So for me, what I love about the research in behavioral sciences and experimental economics about trust is that it's very, very precise about what trust is. And that meant for me, on the academic side, it was relatively straightforward to take a big body of work around why people trust each other at an interpersonal level and apply it to new situations. So trust in a brand, trust in a political party. But I think if we can always tie trust back to action as well as belief, tie trust back to what could go right or wrong for the truster, then you always stay rooted in what makes trust so valuable for individuals, for brands, for political parties, for organizations. So for me, it's that precision that really is the battle we always have to keep fighting.
The other day I was reading a story about how the trust in Boeing has gone down the last 2 or 3 years with all these unfortunate accidents, and how important it is to, and how difficult it is to rebuild that. And so how can we use the results from academic work in a case like, for example, for Boeing, and how can we do that, and who is going to do that?
I really like sitting on the intersection between the academic world and the business world and the more practitioner world, because I do think there's this rich seam of research and so much out there that is so useful as a practitioner, that stops you just reaching for the most straightforward, simple answer, and actually helps you see what the underlying problem is, see more innovative solutions. But the translation process is often really hard, and it's not something academics are often very good at. And there's always a kind of instinct to play it safe and say, not recommend anything until every single bit of research has been kind of proven in each field. And actually, as a practitioner, you want to say, I don't need you to prove that this will work for me. I need you to give me a hypothesis that I can go and test in my practice, my area, and see if I'm working for Boeing. Maybe it will work for Boeing, maybe it won't. But give me an interesting new way of looking at this so I can solve the problem rather than just the same way it's been solved again and again and again unsuccessfully.
Well, Steve, thank you very much for being our guest today. I really appreciated the time you took for a busy job you have at Edelman. I wish you and Edelman a lot of success, and I'm sure we meet again soon.
Fantastic. So nice to see you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Trust Talk. We hope that you found the conversation valuable and informative. At Trust Talk, we believe in the power of trust to create positive change in the world. If you believe in our mission, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can help keep Trust Talk going by making a donation on our website at trusttalk.co/donate. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue bringing you thoughtful and engaging podcasts. Thank you for your support and for listening to Trust Talk. We look forward to meeting you again for future episodes.